Welcome back. I'm your presenter, Alyssa Charrier, and today we are going to be discussing what makes a healthy brain. So, as you recall, the definition of health by the WHO is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So, we have previously focused on both the physical and social aspects of health, and this week we'll be focusing on mental health. So take a minute to look at this figure and determine the regions of the world with the highest numbers of mental health and substance use disorders. From this slide, it seems that some of the areas where we see the highest proportion of these disorders in the population are in the US and Australia, followed by Canada and many European countries, and then we see them next in countries like Russia and many African countries. And finally, they're seen the least in many Asian countries. We'll get into why this might be in a second. I want you to ask yourself, is this really because mental health issues are less of a problem in these countries, or is it possibly because of other underlying factors? So now take a look at this figure and determine the areas in the world with the highest reported life satisfaction. It's interesting to note that the countries where we see the highest satisfaction are countries where we also see some of the higher prevalence of mental health and substance use disorders, like Canada, the US, Australia, and European countries. And this is an interesting paradox. So, why are the countries that report such high mental health and substance abuse disorders also reporting the highest life satisfaction? Well, let's talk about some of the limitations that may be involved in the data collection itself. First of all, reporting in general, in many of the countries where we see the lowest recorded substance and mental health disorders, this could just be that numbers in these regions of the world are not being reported, and persons in these regions are not actually seeking out help. Additionally, in areas where we see high prevalence of reported mental health disorders, but a high level of life satisfaction, this could be because in these areas, people are actively able to seek out help and treatment, which can lead to higher life satisfaction. One of the main reasons that this paradox still exists, though, is the stigma of mental health that exists in most areas of the world, although in some areas the stigma is higher than others. So, what is the stigma of mental health? Well, we should first understand what stigma is. A stigma is when someone views someone else in a negative way because they have a distinguishing trait or characteristic that is thought to be, or actually is, a disadvantage. In other words, we would think of this as a negative stereotype. Negative attitudes and beliefs towards people with mental health conditions is really common, and a stigma towards persons with mental health conditions can then lead to discrimination. So let's take a look at what the prevalence of mental distress looks like in the US. The darkest red areas are the areas of highest prevalence, and the lightest pink areas are the least prevalence. Does the trend on this map look familiar? Well, it should. If you remember back to when we talked about food deserts and the prevalence of poverty in the US, the trends correlated very similarly to this map, which is very interesting. Additionally, in the US, the major age group of concern are adolescents and young adults aged 10 to 24. It's this group that we sadly see an alarmingly high rate of suicide. Suicide and mental distress are highly correlated. And college students fit right into this age group. So just to provide some strats, 40 million US adults have suffered from an anxiety or do suffer from an anxiety disorder. And of these, 75%, to put this in perspective, experienced their first episode of anxiety at the age of 22. So this is when many of them are in college and college-age students. So this could be you, and you may not even understand why you aren't feeling the same or even like yourself. If we look even closer at college students, 30% report that stress negatively affected their performance. 85% have felt overwhelmed in the past year. 41.6 state they feel anxiety is a top concern, and 24.5% of students reported taking psychotropic medications. The main take home in this is that if this is you, you're not alone. In fact, there are many students and people your age feeling just as you do. You might think that BYU students are different than students from around the country, but this is actually not the case. In fact, BYU students follow national trends for both anxiety disorders and depression statistics. So just based on what we know that 24.5% of college students are taking psychotropic medications, and in 2018, BYU enrollment was 22,719 students. So from this, we can estimate that around 5,566 BYU students were also taking psychotropic medications. Nationally, 1 in 3 students reported prolonged periods of depression. And once again, BYU enrollment in 2018 was 22,719. This means an estimated 7,573 BYUI students also have experienced prolonged periods of depression. So what are the effects of mental health? Well, one major effect is productivity. In fact, globally, mental and behavioral disorders resulted in the highest percentage of time lost to disability from all medical causes. And you may be wondering, after all this data, is there hope for me or my friends or someone I love who is struggling with mental health issues? And the answer is yes. Elder Jeffrey L. Holland has stated that old sailing ships had periods when the wind did not blow, they were dead in the water, but the wind will return, the sails will fill, and you will come into port. One of the reasons I can give you for hope today is the concept of brain neuroplasticity and also some ways or understanding of what can keep our brain healthy. So, the human brain is really an amazing thing, and we're only beginning to crack the wonders of this organ. It only weighs 3 pounds, but uses more than 20% of all your energy. The brain has 100 billion neurons. These are cells, and each of these neurons can make up to 10,000 connections. The brain also contains more than 10 times as many supporting cells called neuroglia, whose role is to maintain homeostasis and to support and protect the neurons. And while we still don't know everything there is to know about the brain, the field of neuroscience is fast growing, and it's answering really important questions that make it a very exciting field to study. As little as 25 years ago, we thought that after puberty, the only changes to the brain were negative. And this includes our understanding of aging, stroke, dementia, etc. Now we know that behavior changes the brain, meaning every experience that you have or create changes the brain for good or bad. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to reorganize itself, creating new connections in response to our environment and even our thoughts. So I hope you're catching on here. You're not stuck. The key is to learning in brain health is neuroplasticity. You can do things that help your brain to reorganize and create new connections. And we can do things to help our brains be as healthy as possible. So going back to the opening slide, what makes a healthy brain? Let's just review a couple of scriptures. We've already talked in the past few weeks about the word of wisdom and making healthy food choices and physical activity choices. And in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, we read, "Know ye not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" We also know from the word of wisdom, the promises given to us in section 89, verses 18 through 19, which says, "And all saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments, shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge and even hidden treasures." So in addition to the food and activity choices, physical choices we can make to be healthier, we can also focus on the other pillars that make up the 7 pillars of brain health. And these are physical and nutritional, which we've already discussed in the depth, medical, sleep and relaxation, mental, social, we've also discussed this one, and spiritual. And when these are all in balance, we are helping our mental health to be at its best. When these supporting pillars get out of balance, this leads to declines in mental health. And of course, there is an important place for therapists and doctors for those that truly suffer from clinical disorders and even medication. But many of us who don't suffer from clinical depression or anxiety, we can take a look at our lives and even those that do, actually, when we aren't feeling like ourselves or at our best self, we can ask ourselves, are all my pillars in balance? And so we can all be doing things to keep these pillars in balance in order to keep our brains healthy. So I'm going to end this discussion with some questions for you to reflect on when it comes to your mental health being in balance. Some things I want you to think about this week as you go on your own is how balances my life? What are 2 areas I could improve on? So for example, right now, I know I could improve on going to bed earlier and eating less Christmas sweets, right? So those are some ideas, but obviously there's a whole plethora of them that could be. What are areas where I'm doing best, and what are the barriers I'm facing that impact my ability to be balanced? So those are just some things to think about. Not to get down on yourself, just make small changes a little bit at a time to start to make sure your pillars are aligned and in balance to keep your brain as healthy as possible. I'll see you next time.